Good morning, and welcome to your daily news briefing on Indigenous rights, tribal sovereignty, and federal policy updates across the United States and Canada for today, Monday, July 27, 2026. Today, we dive into the major legal battles, food and energy independence, and the ongoing push for tribal self-determination. Let's get right into the news. First up, in land and water rights, according to reporting from the Native News Online, federal judges heard oral arguments in a high-stakes lawsuit brought by the Tohono O'odham Nation against federal border wall construction. The tribe is challenging the building of infrastructure across their ancestral lands along the U.S.-Mexico border. Why it matters? The border physically cuts through traditional Tohono O'odham territory, restricting tribal members from visiting family, accessing sacred burial grounds, and performing traditional ceremonies. The sovereignty impact? Land sovereignty, which gives tribes the authority to govern ancestral territory and protect cultural heritage. When federal agencies build without true consultation, it directly undermines tribal authority over sacred sites. The opposition? Federal attorneys and border agents arguing that the national security laws are federal mandate overrides, which are the local tribal land claims and belong in international borders. Next up, as reported by Indian Country Today News, water protectors from the Menominee Nation launched a traditional 17-foot pipe dugout canoe on the Menominee River for the first time in decades. Why it matters. Carving and navigating traditional canoes reconnects Native youth with historic waterways, cultural traditions, and environmental stewardship. The sovereignty impact? Water sovereignty. It is tied directly to cultural governance. Reclaiming historic waterways asserts that Indigenous nations hold continuous rights to manage and protect natural resources. The opposition? Regional developers and mining companies seeking permits nearby often oppose tribal environmental rules that could restrict industrial runoff into the river basin. All right, turning to federal policy and the courts, reported jointly by the National Congress of American Indians and Indian Country Today News, intertribal coalitions and conservation groups they filed legal challenges demanding the full restoration of national monument boundaries at Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. The suits argue federal restrictions and federal reductions exceeded executive authority. Now, why this matters, these monuments protect thousands of sacred archaeological sites, ancestral burial grounds, and traditional medicinal plants. Now, the sovereignty impact is co-management agreements between federal agencies and Native nations set a major precedent for joint land governance. Reversing protection strips tribal voices from decision-making on sacred lands. The opposition? State officials and commercial mining and logging lobbies argue that large monument designations limit state land management and restrict economic growth. In food and education sovereignty today, K through 12 schools, as this is coming from Native News Online, K through 12 schools across the Navajo Nation are launching new agricultural programs. Students are now learning to grow traditional crops, study indigenous nutrition, and prepare traditional foods. Why it matters. Historic disruptions to traditional farming created severe food insecurity and health issues in Native communities. Teaching kids to grow their own food builds community health resilience. The sovereignty impact? Food sovereignty, which means a community controls its own food supply and farming policies, reclaiming traditional agricultural reductions dependency on outside supply chains. The opposition? School administrators note that tight budgets and state standardized testing requirements often push schools to prioritize core testing over hands-on agricultural classes. Also reported today by Native News Online, the American Indian College Fund has secured $2.4 million in new grant funding to support Indigenous arts and community education across tribal colleges and universities. Why it matters. Tribal colleges serve as vital hubs for preserving Native languages, histories, and art forms that non-Native universities frequently overlook. The sovereignty impact? Education sovereignty, which empowers Native nations to set their own learning goals, preserve cultural knowledge systems, and prepare future tribal leaders. The opposition? Critics of targeted cultural funding argue higher education grants should be used and distributed through centralized state funds rather than identity-based tribal allocations. Moving on to sports and indigenous media, as reported by Indian Country Today, the Oglala Lakota Nation officially opened the Chatku Arts Center near Pine Ridge, South Dakota. The center houses over 12,000 archival Lakota items and provides space for local Native artists and film projects. Why it matters. It gives local community members a place to archive historic artifacts and sell artwork directly to visitors, building the local reservation economy. The sovereignty impact? Cultural sovereignty, which means indigenous people, rather than outside museums, control, display, and interpret their own history and creative media. All right, here's a quick look at severe weather warnings affecting tribal lands today out here in the Southwest, including the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, the Tohono O'odham Nation. Excessive heat warnings are in effect with temperatures reaching up to 110 degrees, along with several flash flood warnings from summer monsoons. Extreme heat strains off-grid water supplies and power grids, highlighting the need, again, for local utility resilience. Northern Plains and Northwest. Across the Northern Plains and interior Northwest, including the Oglala Sioux and Blackfeet Nation, red flag warnings are posted for extreme wildfire danger due to dry conditions and high winds. Tribal emergency management teams are exercising sovereign protocols to protect community borders and timber resources. And to our friends and relatives north of the border up in Canada, First Nations across the Yukon, Alberta, and Northwest Territories still face air quality advisories caused by active forest fires. Now for our deep dive into Native American infrastructure, energy development, and utility sovereignty from the past 48 hours. Official updates from the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Indian Energy says that they finalized the application reviews for up to $50 million of grant programs focused on microgrids, solar energy, and grid modernization for tribal lands. Why this matters. Many rural reservation homes lack reliable power or rely on costly diesel generators. Microgrids keep the lights on for homes, schools, and medical facilities. The sovereignty impact is it's energy sovereignty, y'all. They get to manage and they get to figure out how to keep their lights on no matter what. Microgrids could really help with that. All right, so another story is coming out by the Native News Online. The Rosebud Sioux Tribe approved final plans for a $4.6 million behavioral health center on tribal land. Why it matters? The facility provides culturally integrated care for mental health and addicted rights right there at home, keeping patients close to their families. Now, the sovereignty impact is that developing tribal-owned healthcare reduces reliance on federal Indian health services and it exercises direct local governance over healthcare. And our next story, joint reports from the U.S. Department of Energy and the Industrial Information Resources. The Department of Energy opened up its 2026 National Draft Transmission Needs Study for formal tribal consultation, identifying where major energy lines will cross Western lands near reservations. Why this matters. Over 500 tribes sit along vital energy corridors. Right-of-way agreements bring in tribal revenue to some tribes, but routes must carefully avoid sacred sites. So again, just continue to keep an eye on that one. And as reported by Indians.com, the reauthorization of NAHASDA, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, stalled in the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. Why this matters. NAHASDA provides essential block grants to build affordable homes, repair roofs, and install plumbing on reservations. The sovereignty impact? Housing block grants allow tribal housing authorities to spend federal funds where community needs are greatest rather than following one-size-fits-all federal orders. The opposition? Some federal lawmakers want to add overall spending limits or housing policy changes to the law before approving full reauthorization. All right, to wrap up today's briefing here there are some 3 upcoming events for tribal leaders and policy staff. Department of Energy is opening up their Tribal Home Energy Rebates webinar, which takes place tomorrow, July 28th, covering energy efficiency funding for reservation homes. And also coming up for the next event is FEMA. FEMA's opening up a Homeland Security grant briefing, which runs through late July and August, focusing on public safety and emergency alert tech for tribal managers. All right, that wraps up for today's daily news. Again, thank you to all the sources of information that we get this from. We scoured the internet looking for some of the best and greatest up-to-date information that tribal leaders, tribal members, all around the 500 plus tribal lands and tribal communities are wanting to know. We want to make sure that you like and share this podcast to make sure that we continue this wonderful podcast today, which is July 27th. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again tomorrow morning for another Daily Sovereignty Report.